All right, I'm going to head over to, I guess, New York City or wherever my friend David is hanging out in, and say,
Where I am.
hey, good afternoon. How are you?
Good. Do you hear me?
I hear you fine. Yeah.
All right, great. Yeah, I'm fine. That was really, I wish I could have come on earlier. I had another meeting. But you know, anyway, it's inspiring to see musicians that have, um, been around and made it through all sorts of trials and tribulations to get to a good place. I mean, it seems like your last guest was in a really, or is in a really good place, which is nice to see. After I mean, quite a career, right, with Bad Company
And free, and
and
yeah,
Free,
and
and yeah.
it's music that we listen to, and all of a sudden I'm talking to the people who creating that music. It's kind of surreal, David.
Yeah, no, it really is, and it's great to sort of get the personality, actually see what the real person is like, because obviously on stage it's a persona, and
Yeah.
and a persona, certain people's personas, like you mentioned Harry Chapin. I mean, honestly, Harry Chapin on stage and off stage were kind of the same person. I think that's kind of what made him so endearing. Um, and then, on the other end of it, you've got like a band like Kiss or something like that, where, they just become completely different people when they get on stage. So, it's,
Did you find that with people coming into the studio, the artists that you knew recording their songs, when if you saw them at a show, were they even recognizable, or I mean, did they shift at all?
you know, I, I think, it's so variable. I think that certain people who are particularly shy, um, uh, as people, to get on stage, it becomes a little bit of an act. And not that that's a bad thing, but it's like they really have to push themselves to get up on that stage. So, uh, I think you had mentioned Suzanne Vega. She's generally a pretty shy person, really introspective, very, certainly friendly, but I wouldn't say outgoing in the way that, like, she's going to just be super gregarious. On the other hand, when she gets on stage, she's sort of got down her act, and it's, she brings you into her world. Um, and, I think that can be really effective. But I also think the Harry Chapin, just sort of, hey, I'm one of you, can also be really effective.
And
So.
maybe even more so. I should have done a proper introduction and said that you're an amazing person, that you are a doctor, and you work with musicians. You were a recording engineer. I don't know, but you love music, and it seems to have had a positive impact on you. And I thank you for all the people who you work with to help them with their addictions to get through times. I imagine 2020 has been not a good time for some people, and it's been a hard time. um and I thank you for that. I'm serious. I only realized like a couple of weeks ago how special that poster was that Harry Chapin and Steve Goodman and Pete Seeger signed, that it was hanging on our basement for the longest time. um and I guess for people who don't know part of your journey, I'm just would like to embarrass you a little bit and talk about some of the people that you recorded in your studio, and somehow you ended up in the jam band space, and then how you ended up dedicating your time to helping people deal with addiction. So,
Sure. Shoot. I'll try to answer.
so everyone wants a recording studio, and I remember the one of the memories I have is you were playing with the advanced digital recordings back then, the early DATs, when right when you were working with Suzanne Vega. How did you actually make that transition from being an intern at RCA to opening a studio?
I Well, yeah, it was kind of interesting. So at RCA, I was, a young kid, really. I mean, I was, 19, I think, when I started there. And so, during the day, it was kind of run kind of very much like an office. It was just like, the session is from 3 to 8 and you're working with, whoever it is you're working with. And it's, but then in the evenings, it got much looser. And sometimes even, there'd be a room available, and I could just bring people in there for free. Nobody would say anything.
Really?
And yeah. And, so I kind of, it was good for the bands or the artists. And, I guess at the same time, I was also like a young person. So I started hanging around Greenwich Village and went down to this club called the Speakeasy, which was sort of around the corner from this club, Folk City. So Folk City was like, where the real folk singers played. You would, come see, your Tom Paxtons or, people who could draw, solid 150 plus people. But then around the corner, there was this place called the Speakeasy, which is where sort of this burgeoning songwriters movement, which largely surrounded this artist named Jack Hardy. And they all hung out at the Speakeasy. And then this other little place called the Cornelia Street Cafe, which unfortunately closed last year. Speakeasy closed many years ago. And so, I started hanging out at the Speakeasy there, and this Jack Hardy came up with this idea. He's like, listen, obviously none of the artists here are going to get signed by major labels. And he was somewhat wrong on that, but at the time it did feel like that was probably true. He's like, let's record a bunch of artists, so we'll put it out on this thing called the Coop. He called it the Coop. I don't know. I called it the Co-op, but either way, I think, since it was his, I should go by his term. So anyway, it was called the Coop, and on those first couple records, were some people like Suzanne Vega, Sean Colvin. Those are people who eventually signed to major labels, and then there were other people who you didn't hear about, like Jack Hardy, Richard Meyer, Judy Wyman, who I know had actually shown up here as a
yes.
Yeah,
Judy's now a friend.
Yeah. So, all these people were on these records, and they were sent out to radio stations around the country, mostly college stations, and sort of this whole little songwriter movement, started to grow a bit. And then there was a connection that happened between, because of these records, between New York and Texas, and something called the Kerrville Music Festival, which still exists, and a guy named Rod Kennedy, and he started having these songwriting competitions, and it just sort of grew fairly organically. So at that time, originally I think the first record was done by a guy named Mark Dan, who's still around as a producer, excellent producer up in Woodstock, New York. And I think it was done on a 4-track cassette machine, if I remember.
Wow. Wow.
And then, and then moved up from there. He ended up getting an 8-track machine. And eventually I ended up getting an 8-track machine. Then I got really lucky. I befriended a guy at a company called Studer, which made great tape machines. And he told me that that Paul McCartney's old tape machine was sitting in the basement at, I guess it was Sony Studios, and nobody wanted it.
Oh, thank you.
And so I was like, sure, yeah, I'll take that. And then maintaining that thing was like, it was like maintaining an old Fiat. It's just like something would break every day. but it was, it was great. I mean, it was, and it, as I said, it just all happened very organically. And I moved that into my parents' house in Great Neck and basically took over their second floor, and that was the recording studio.
And then how and the artists came to you organically?
Well, I mean, so one thing leads to another, and one artist led to another, and I met so Suzanne, I guess because of I'm trying to think. Yeah, I mean, those records, those early records made it up to Boston, and then at that point we started looking around, like, could we make records in other cities? Were there other scenes going on? And Boston had a good scene, so we made a record up there, and that included Tracy Chapman, who at that time I think maybe she was still at Tufts University, I think.
Fast Car, did she record
no, she did For My Lover, actually, for that record, but it was it was just so clear that this was a star.
Sure.
Wow. And then we did a record up in Toronto, which included people like Lorena McKinnett, and it was a really good record. And by the way, all these records are Jack Hardy was kind of the leader of the pack here, but someone who helped him out and actually ended up taking it over was a guy named Richard Meyer, who unfortunately passed away. But before he died, he was able to resurrect all the recordings, preserve them, and then finally we as a board, a board of directors, we gave the whole thing to the to the Smithsonian.
Wow.
And they've released all of the records, and you can get it all on Spotify, and it's a part of history. I was
recorded part of history. And so were you running the place? Were you recording or mixing, or what were you doing there?
I was recording, choosing some artists. We weren't, it wasn't a very hierarchical system, which I think was good. I suppose Jack Hardy, if anybody, and Richard Meyer would have been that top of the hierarchy, but it was really it was kind of like a co-op. We all kind of helped, and the mission was to get this music out there. I guess this kind of songwriting was in a way a reaction to some of the more vacuous pop lyrics that were happening, and
this is the 80s into the 90s.
Yeah, so it was sort of the end of disco, and
hopefully
so this songwriter scene kind of grew up in a way, I guess, at a similar time that the grunge scene was growing up, which in a way was sort of doing a lot of the same. Also was really trying to make a different statement. No,
I hear you. Actually, I never thought of that. I agree with you. So I'm just curious. So how do you end up almost recording Jeff Buckley? Like, how does that happen?
Well, so Jeff used to hang out in the Village. He used to play at a tiny little place called Cafe Chenet, which was, literally the place had like 8 tables in the East Village.
Really?
And it was when the East Village, like, I had an old car, and I'd park it there, and you'd come back and the windows were gone, and
whoa,
the headlights or whatever. But yeah, it was an interesting time in the East Village. But he used to play there, and I used to go see him. And eventually he got signed, and made an amazing first record, the song Hallelujah. Which is
rendition of it
is it is the rendition, I think. So many people have done it, and it's an unbelievable song. I do not take anything away from Leonard Cohen, his own performance, but Jeff took it to another place.
Absolutely.
So after that record, he was going to make another record, and knew I had a studio. At that time it was on 26th Street, and came to record the demos for that record, which we did. And, then he left to go to Nashville on his own, by, driving. And unfortunately, ended up not making it. He had a bit of an alcohol problem, and between alcohol and drugs and riptides, he ended up drowning, so, and it was very, and that led to its own little, so I had the recordings, of course, that we had done as a demo. And honestly, I didn't really know what to do. Of course, literally the day after he died, I get a call from somebody at Sony who wants the tapes.
Oh, yeah.
And I didn't really know how to, if I recall, I think I ended up getting it to his mother, because, Jeff was kind of a perfectionist when it came to, it wasn't, it had to be perfect, but it had to speak to him. And certainly it spoke to a lot of other people, with the few recordings that we have. I honestly, we had never discussed since then, to be honest. I've discussed with almost every artist, if you happen to not, something happens,
what happens?
What am I doing with this recording? What am I doing with these? And you'd be surprised at the responses you get, but Jeff and I never had that discussion. And, eventually they did come out. And it was, I think it was important, that it was understood that this was not a finished work, and it came out under the title of Sketches, which I think is, appropriate, because that's what they were.
I hear you. Wow. But having to do that and the pressure, it's so is that what prompted you to focusing your medical talents on helping people? Was that the trigger for you?
Well, it was one. So it was a confluence of a few things at the same time. So just after that Jeff Buckley recording, my recording studio partners and I, we had an opportunity, a guy basically who worked mostly in construction but was also a musician, brought to our attention this big old theater on the Lower East Side. I mean, it was huge, 8,000 square feet theater, and it literally hadn't been used in, I don't know, 30 or 40 years. It was a old Jewish vaudeville theater called the Clinton Star Theater, because it was sort of it went a whole block between Clinton Street and Attorney Street.
Wow.
Yeah, it was quite a space. And we walked in, and it was a disaster. I mean, I remember walking in with the construction partner, and I was like, "Oh wow, look at this curtain." And he's like, "Don't touch that." I was like, "Okay, I won't touch it. Why?" And he's like, "Because it's asbestos."
Oh no! Oh no! Oh no! Oh no!
And so like he had to get all this remediation. The way they removed that curtain to drop it into this bath. I mean, it was, anyway. But that space was this big, huge, this huge space. And we set up a recording studio in there, and it immediately appealed to bands that play live, because it was just big, and the walls were so not to get too much into acoustics, but the walls were stone, and they had it's just an amazing sound. Nothing sounds like stone, compare it.
So inside, so you're recording. Wow.
It's like in a cavern, but
I get it. Yeah.
And you definitely had to use some techniques to not get too much of that cavern, but it was really magical, because so much recording nowadays, is in rooms with sheetrock walls, and basically the reverb is added afterwards. And
no, this is all natural. This is beautiful.
And
wow.
This was, it attracted a lot of, jam bands like Fish and Mo and Guster, but the one that led me into the field of addiction was a band called Government Mule. Government Mule was formed by large. There's many people in it, but Warren Haynes, who was in the Allman Brothers band, right. And Woody. So those were kind of the two principal, Alan Woody, two principals in the band. And the first day of recording, Alan Woody didn't show up, and basically we found out that he had overdosed in his hotel room. I mean, the funny thing is, we were all, of course, stunned. I left that day thinking, that was the end of that project, maybe the end of the band. But I mean, I think that Warren took his grief and he turned it into maybe Government Mule's best album, which is called The Deep End.
Wow.
And he actually wrote that song for Alan Woody. And it's, but at that point, it just became, between Jeff Buckley, Alan Woody, so many artists who had, drug problems, James Taylor, the Grammy Foundation, actually, it came to me and basically said, what can you do? What can we do to help you? And what can you do to help artists? And, at that time, I looked into it, and addiction medicine was just coming into its own as a field. So I kind of morphed my medical practice. I had a part-time practice because I was doing music half the time. And I kind of morphed it into an addiction medicine practice, and then, kind of learned on the fly. It was kind of as Harry Chapin used to say, earn while you learn. So
you earned while you learned.
Yeah. So, wow. That was that's how I ended up, and I learned about a lot of the, the connection between, it's not as strange it's not a coincidental connection between addiction and creativity. It's, that's a whole other,
I hear you. Yeah.
Thing one could have a discussion about, but certainly to be an artist is making yourself vulnerable in a way that's,
of course, No, it's hard. Well, I'll continue this thread in a moment, assuming I have time. But I do want to ask you. So, how do you, growing up in Great Neck, end up hanging out with Pete Seeger and working with Bruce Springsteen on an album? How exactly did that happen?
I mean, completely unscripted. I'd like to say, well, point A led to point B. I think if there's, I try to attend as many of your interviews as possible here. And if there's one theme, it seems to be, is that very few times do people, do people say that it was a scripted thing. It's like one
thing, right?
Right. What was the guest you had last week where he was, he ended up playing with like Paul McCartney, and how that,
Brian Ray. Yeah,
Brian Ray, and how that happened. I mean, you could never have planned that out.
Right.
So I mean, I can now look back on it and say, oh yeah, that sort of made sense. But
did you actually, were you friends with Pete Seeger, or were you friends with Bruce Springsteen at the time when that happened?
So I had met Pete, mostly through Harry. Well, actually, so evidently I'd met Pete when I was 3 years old, because he was my first concert my parents took me to in Provincetown, Massachusetts.
Of course it was.
But I don't remember that. But actually, it was a fellow named Jim Musselman who owned a company called Appleseed Recordings. He's very socially active and really, was really good friends with Pete and really bonded with Pete on a lot of Pete's social activities, socially conscious activities. And I say socially conscious activities rather than politics, because actually, although Pete, I think it's wrong to just say he was like a political folk singer. He was a socially conscious folk singer, and sometimes people drew him into politics, but that wasn't really his thing. But anyway, Jim had this record company, Appleseed Recordings, and I had met him. I think through the Folk Alliance, a lot of the folk singers I was recording, and so he utilized me to record first with Pete Seeger and Arlo Guthrie together.
Oh wow!
And then and then came this opportunity where, Bruce Springsteen had really gotten into the work of Pete Seeger, and he did an album of Pete Seeger songs, and he wanted to pay Pete a lot of money, and Pete was like, no, I'm not going to accept it. Finally, they agreed. I think, if I recall, Bruce gave the Clearwater Foundation, which is, cleaning up the Hudson. I think he gave him like $1 million or something, but Pete wouldn't accept anything. But, but then Pete wanted to sort of pay it back in a way. So Pete wanted to record his version of Tom Joad, which is sort of loosely based on Pete, actually. But at that point he was over 90 or just about 90, and his voice wasn't that great. So he sort of did a spoken word rendition of it. And then I sent it to Bruce, and then he had me, he recorded the vocal. We were sending things back and forth. And actually, this was pre being able to send files all over the country. So I literally took the tracks, took it down to Texas. This guy, Dave Hamburger, did a dobro part. I took it. Fish had introduced me to a percussionist up in Woodstock who is really great. I took it to him so it went all over the country. And then, finally it came out as this duet with Pete Seeger and Bruce Springsteen. So.
Wow. Amazing. Wow. And were you, do you have any recording credits on that album?
Well, I guess just, for that recording that goes to Tom Joad, I guess
but you have the recording memories though, which are sometimes more important.
Yeah, I mean, I think credit, unfortunately, I think first with CDs, because they were so small compared to vinyl, and now with file sharing, credits really unfortunately get lost. It's kind of a shame, because there's some amazing session musicians out there who have played on so many records. Well, you've actually interviewed a few of them.
Yes. More. And I have a much greater appreciation for session musicians now than ever before.
They're key.
Well, I'll rely on your help, and maybe together you and I can interview some of your friends.
Sure.
Who you recorded maybe on the jam bands and stuff. I am grateful, David. It's Thanksgiving's coming up, and one of the things I'm grateful for 2020 is for saying hello to you again. I never knew that 40 years sounded so clear, and I'm grateful to be a friend, and I appreciate your storytelling, and I just love how our lives are interconnected with music, both in the physical realm and in the realm that are the ties that bind. Thank you. And are you right now I guess as a doctor you're actively dealing with addiction?
Right. So yeah, I do run in a couple addiction treatment programs, inpatient programs, plus I do outpatient detoxes. I also try to help a lot of other doctors around the country who are just sort of getting into the field. In New York, it wasn't so hard for me to find mentors, because you know, at both Cornell and Beth Israel, Mount Sinai, there's some good, you know, really good people. A guy named Ed Salsitz, you know, a bunch of people who taught me so much. But of course, in the middle of the country and some of the smaller towns, they're having horrible problems with addiction, but they've got nobody to treat it. So, you know, I really love so many of these patients. And again, this could be a discussion at a later time, but, you know, so many of these patients have amazing stories. They're artists. They're some of the most creative people you'll ever meet. And unfortunately, you know, a lot of them, their stories are cut short by this, you know, by this addiction. So.
Well, I thank you on behalf of everyone who loves music for the work that you do and helping people deal with it and address it. And thank you for mentoring the doctors that need help in getting started in their addiction practices. And really, thank you for being a friend. And I don't know, I can go on and on, but David, thank you.
I can say the same, but Jeff, somebody needs to you know, it's funny if you look up Jeff on LinkedIn or one of those, you know, Jeff has had quite an amazing career. He doesn't really talk about it. So someone's got to interview you sometime.
Otherwise I could talk to myself and ask.
There you go.
But we won't go there, but David, thank you so much. And thanks for hanging out with us. I'm grateful, really. And really, that was beautiful.